I thought I'd set the context for this by talking about the fact that I lived in Rome in the early 1960s during the time of the Second Vatican Council. I was fortunate to be there from 1960 to 1967, and the council was 1962 to 1965. And one of the most wonderful things that happened to me during that time was meeting a priest from Naples who lived in the Baracchi area, the very poor areas around the city of Naples. And I and some friends would visit him, Father Mario Borelli. And there were a group of college students, young college students, who would come to this very, very poor area and were very inspired by the Second Vatican Council. They were very inspired to go and meet their neighbors whom previously they had never met. And I was very, very impressed by these young college students who really were dedicated to helping the poor. And a lot of that came from the inspiration of the Second Vatican Council. I'll just read one quote from the document Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. So it's a beautiful quote about the pastoral nature of the Second Vatican Council, moving from doctrine and the gospel out to caring for people in the world. So we're very happy today to have a representative of the Sant'Egidio community, also that began in the city of Rome soon after the Second Vatican Council. Andrea Bartoli will be telling us about the Sant'Egidio community and the young people who brought food to the poor, who grew up to serve their neighbor throughout the world, and now even in this country in the United States. So I'm delighted to introduce Andrea, who will talk about conflict resolution, the experience of peacemaking, learning from the community of Sant'Egidio. Andrea will tell you something about himself. I can tell you that he's the Dean of the School of Conflict Resolution, Conflict Analysis and Resolution, George Mason University in Virginia, and works primarily on peacemaking and genocide prevention. Dr. Bartoli started the Sant'Egidio community in the United States in 1993 in New York City. Since then, there are other communities have begun in numerous cities throughout the United States. And we're also delighted to welcome as our respondent to Dr. Bartoli's talk, Professor Elizabeth DeFeese from our own Seton Hall Law School, former Dean of the Law School. She has lectured internationally on human rights, the rule of law, democracy and constitution building, electoral reform, and standards for independence of the judiciary. Her expertise has been requested by governments, intergovernmental institutions, and the United Nations. So we're delighted, and I'm delighted to introduce a good friend, Andrea Bartoli, to speak on conflict resolution today. Thanks.
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Monsignor Lidi. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about a subject that is very close to my heart. Almost 20 years after I came as an immigrant to this country to follow the peace work of the Community of Sant'Egidio that was about to produce the General Peace Agreement in Mozambique. Monsignor Lidi observed the other day, I'm sure you have given a talk like this a number of times. Yes, indeed, in the past 20 years I've spoken about peacemaking and Sant'Egidio a number of times. But I always maintain one rule, never to repeat the same speech. So I trust that my adherence to the title of this lecture will prove helpful to the audience as much as it was to me. I must admit that I present these notes with some trepidation, as they present a mix of scholarly and personal reflections that might help illuminate the challenges and opportunities of learning from experience as precious as peacemaking. On October 4th, 1992, the Mozambique General Peace Agreement was signed in Rome. Among those celebrating was Bishop Jaime Gonçalves, the Archbishop of Beira, one of the 4 mediators who followed the process through the 2 years and a half between the joint first communique and the signing of the agreement. The chairman of that group was an Italian parliamentarian, Mario Raffaelli. The other 2 were Professor Andrea Riccardi and Don Matteo Maria Zuppi, both of them with the Community of Sant'Egidio, the international protagonist of peacemaking that we encountered today as a source of learning. Andrea Riccardi was its founder. It started it when he was 18. How many 18 years old do we have today? Almost. Oh, 1. Very good. Fantastic. Welcome. A student in a public high school in Rome. Matteo Zuppi was the first layperson who, having joined the community as a student in the same Liceo Virgilio, the public school where the community started, became a priest, and then 2 weeks ago, actually, an auxiliary bishop of Rome. The Community of Sant'Egidio is indeed an original player in the international scene, the expression of spiritual longing that finds its roots and milieu in the Roman Catholic Church. The community was born after Second Vatican Council. While secular in its work and respectfully capable of interacting with civilian institutions, the community presents itself first and foremost as a spiritual space, a human experience in which members and non-members alike are invited to open themselves to the Word of God and the discipline of service. Without these fundamental references, it would be difficult to attempt to describe the riches of the peace work done by the Community of Sant'Egidio in its more than 40 years of existence. As Ivory Coast, the professor at Harvard, recently noted, the Community of Sant'Egidio is an harbinger of a rebirth of faith founded on actually following Jesus. The community is a model of how faith can reemerge. I've been a member of the Community of Sant'Egidio for more than 40 years. I was younger than 18 when I joined. And so this reflection will inevitably have a self-reflective connotation. I will also focus my talk around the Mozambique case as a way to make full use of the distance from the signing of the agreement that allows us some perspective on the process involved and also an opportunity for celebration. 20 years are indeed the longest time that Mozambique as a country has been at peace, independent, and united. Let's recognize and celebrate this precious achievement of Mozambique as a whole. At the end of the last century, the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, asked me to write a chapter dedicated to actual peace processes and lessons that could be learned from them. I wrote my contribution, and I'm circulating few experts tonight to give you a sense of the learning that emerged from that milieu. We identified 12 of them. The first, involve all the parties. The second, do so within a logical framework. The third, make sure that all parties engage in the negotiation. The fourth, understand the process. The fifth, involve the international community. The sixth, respect local culture and identities and languages. The seventh, do not follow a preconceived set of rules and procedures. The eighth, emphasize negotiation as political process. The ninth, strive for appropriateness. The tenth, be faithful to the process. The 11th, create political institutions based on the agreement, and the 12, let civil society participate. It could be helpful to revisit these lessons 12 years after they were produced, and maybe link them to the ones that Professor Coleman suggested after a long research aimed at analyzing the Mozambique peace process through the lens of dynamical system theory. That inquiry highlights some insight. The first, that conflict reveals and conceals the inadequacy of the parties, the system, and those involved. That conflict occurs in relational systems. That conflict affects the identities of the parties and those involved through meaning making. That the parties are constrained by the conflict. That the conflict reveals the power structures and their limits. That the parties are trapped in escalation through a process of reactionary moves. That conflict can be addressed constructively through processes of inquiry and engagement. And finally, that conflict can be understood better through the lenses of dynamical systems. It could be tempting for me, as Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, to delve in this learning. But this lecture attempts to articulate a conversation between the experiential reaches of the Community of Sant'Egidio and peacemaking. This intentional contribution to peace that was so transformative in so many cases and demand on this current time. A conversation among all of us on the responsibility to make history properly, responsibly, lovingly. The nexus of these conversations are around learning. So I will move in a different direction. Without discounting what I would describe as technical learning, some of which I mentioned before, I would like us to consider some further thoughts around two questions. Who is the agent of this learning about peacemaking? And could learning about peacemaking be a crucial responsibility while facing the future that is coming? So, who is learning? I will focus on three categories of learners: the parties, the companions, the observers. To give some context while addressing these first questions, I would like you to pay attention to the joint communique signed in Sant'Egidio in Rome in 1990. You should have a little handout. It's my little gift for you. And I need a student.
I think there are only 50, so maybe some people...
Some may have it, some may not have it. Okay. And I need a student who is gutsy and able to read. Some volunteers. Please, come. Bring it with you. Very good. Your name is?
Greg.
Greg, welcome. We are making history today. Okay, so why don't we read this document together for a moment?
All right. From 8th to July of 1990, at the headquarters of the Community of Sant'Egidio, Rome, a direct meeting took place between a delegation of the government of the People's Republic of Mozambique, headed by Armando Emilio Guebuza, Minister of Transport and Communications, and a delegation of Renamo, headed by Raul Manuel Domingos, Chief of External Relations Department.
So, just for you to give you context for a moment, this is the first time that these two delegations meet together. Never happened before. They have been fighting one another for more than 15 years. They had 1 million deaths on a country that was 12 million people. Almost 10% of the population had died when they meet. And Guebuza, the head of the delegation, is now the president of Mozambique. But at that time, he was just the Minister of Transport because he was marginalized, because he was hardliner. He was the one that wanted to fight the most against everybody. And so the president, Chissano, said, well, better for me to get the extremist, the one who is against the agreement, to head the delegation. So if he fails, he's the one failing. But if he succeeds, I'm bringing him into the process. It was a very smart move from Chissano's part. Go ahead.
Mario Raffaelli, representative of the government of the Italian Republic, Andrea Riccardi and Matteo Zuppi, both of the Community of Sant'Egidio, and Jaime Gonçalves, Archbishop of Beira, attended the meeting as observers.
So here you have an Italian parliamentarians of the Socialist Party, 2 members of the Community of Sant'Egidio, and a bishop. What a strange combination.
The 2 delegations, acknowledging themselves to be compatriots and members of great Mozambican families, expressed satisfaction and pleasure at this direct, open, and frank meeting, the first to take place between the 2 parties. The 2 parties expressed interest and willingness to do everything possible to conduct a constructive search for a lasting peace for their country and their people. Taking into account the higher interest of the Mozambican nation, the 2 parties agreed that they must set aside what divides them and focus as a matter of priority on what unites them in order.
Let's stop for a moment on this particular sentence. I will speak about this in my talk. But this sentence was mentioned, and this is, I'm so glad that Monsignor Lidi invited us to reflect on Vatican II, was shared with everybody in the world by Pope John XXIII. He comes directly from Pope John XXIII, through the Council, through Sant'Egidio, through the Mozambique Peace Agreement, and it was repeated thousands of times in Mozambique. Think about just a little sentence, but it's a reorientation sentence. And I repeat, it says, taking into account the higher interest of the Mozambique nation, the 2 parties agreed that they must set aside what divides them and focus as a matter of priority on what unites them. Very interesting. It's a reorientation from division to unity that comes directly through Sant'Egidio from Vatican II. Go ahead.
In order to establish a common working basis so that in a spirit of mutual understanding they can engage in dialogue in which they discuss their different points of view. The 2 delegations affirmed their readiness to dedicate themselves fully in a spirit of mutual respect and understanding to the search for a working basis from which to end the war and create the necessary political, economic, and social conditions for building a lasting peace and normalizing the life of all Mozambican citizens. At the close of the meetings, the 2 delegations decided to meet again in due course at Rome, in the presence of the same observers. They expressed satisfaction and gratitude for the spirit of friendship and the hospitality and support shown by them by the Italian government and by all those who helped make this meeting possible. Done at Sant'Egidio, Rome on 10th of July, 1990.
Thank you. Very nice. Very good. And why do I want to share that document? You have even the Portuguese version in you have the actual original sign with people and so on. Because this is how history is made. History is made by people making decisions. History is made by people taking upon themselves the responsibility of responding to something. I have a written speech, and the written speech will be given to Monsignor Lidi, and it will be published, and we will be very happy. But I can see that the students are here, and I need to change a little bit of gear and make sure that we will follow what the substance, the gist of this message is. For almost 20 years, Mozambicans were fighting each other. They were killing each other. They were enemies. And when you are an enemy, you have many advantages. You know who you are. If you know who your enemy is, you have a sense of coherence. You know your place in the world. What do you do in the morning? I am fighting my enemy. I'm fighting my justice against somebody. You know who you are because your enemy is always present to you. But what happened when somebody started thinking, maybe we could have a different way, is that coherence starts vacillating. It becomes uncertain. And we don't function very well in front of uncertainty. So there is a strange value when you are in conflict that you don't really learn anymore. When you are in conflict, in a strange way, you know your answer before the question. You don't need to think anymore. You know that that person is your enemy. You know that you need to gather your energies to fight the enemy, to win your enemy. But you close yourself to the possibility that there may be another way. That there may be a way in which you can actually consider your interests, your needs, your memories, but also the interests, memories, and needs of the others around you. Well, we have examples of this. We know that this is possible. We know that sometimes there are leaders that are capable of doing something like this. Mahatma Gandhi. Wasn't he able to find a solution that was good for him and the British at the same time? For him, for the Indians and the Afrikaner at the same time? Of course. We study him. We learn from him. We know that this is possible. But it's rare. It's very rare. When you are in conflict, the most common attitude is to know your answer before you ask your questions. You don't need to ask any questions because you know already what the answer is. The enemy is evil. I cannot collaborate with the enemy. I cannot get along with those who have killed my family. I cannot have an agreement with the one that is so evil to me, so violently to me. We know that you have people like Mandela that were able to transform a prison in a school for the future, so that they were not saying to the Afrikaner that put them there, oh, you're right, I'm sorry, I'm a criminal. You're right, I'm sorry. No, he was saying, I'm a human being. This prison for you is a school for me. You are putting me here as a criminal, but my dignity, my intelligence, my creativity is able to transform this place into a school for me and for you, a school for me and your children, and a school for me and the whole humanity. So people will learn from me and those who are with me studying a way of a South Africa different than the one that you want to impose on me. So we know that is possible, but it's very difficult. And there is one particular difficulty, that if you speak about peace when you are in an enmity system, when you are constrained by violence, at the wrong time, in the wrong way, the enmity system will kill you. But it's not going to be the enemy that will kill you. It will be the people in your gang. It will be the people of your group. It will be the people of those who do not want to look into that possibility of peace. Gandhi died killed when he was already old. He was barely walking. By whom? Not by a Muslim, not by a British. He was killed by a Hindu. He was not the only one. Yitzhak Rabin was not killed by a Muslim. He was not killed by the enemy. He was killed by his own, by a sectarian Jew that didn't like Rabin peace work, that couldn't stand Rabin peace work. Anwar Sadat was not killed by the Jews, was not killed by a war. was killed when he was welcoming the armies by a Muslim who could not stand his peaceful stand. Rabbani, last year in Kabul, was not killed by the enemies. He was killed by his own. What I'm trying to say is that peacemaking is dangerous. If you speak at the wrong time, with the wrong person, you are going to be dead. The IRA killed many people because they were talking to the British at the wrong time, in the wrong way. An enmity system must control who is talking to whom. So what I'm saying is that when we look at who is learning from the Mozambique peace process, the first response must be those involved. The parties themselves were learning while doing it. And this is a certain kind of learning. It's a difficult one. Because when you do something that you do not know, when you do something that you are venturing, and it's even dangerous, your attitude is not like learning a manual or something that has been already clear, learning algebra or learning something, a chemistry book, but rather learning something that is in the making, something that is tentative. Does anybody know about flying? Anyone? Anyone with a pilot certification? No?
Flying.
Okay.
Flying.
Flying, yeah. Nobody. Okay, imagine one of you starting to fly tomorrow. Well, it would be frightening, wouldn't it? Because it's new to you. You don't know how to do it. But at the same time, it would be exciting. Oh, something new, something different. I can do this. But imagine even more the moment of the Brothers Wright, when they didn't have an airplane, when they start flying for the first time. Oh, mamma mia. Whoa, 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 whoa. Is this going to work? We don't know. So the parties in Mozambique in 1990 were more like the Brothers Wright. They didn't know if the whole thing could work. Am I making any sense? They were building the machine that they could fly on. And they were learning how to fly. And they were then coming back and saying, oh, is this working? Is this not working? Is this good? Is that not good? Am I making any sense? Very good. So that's a certain kind of learning. But it's a very important learning. Then there was the learning of what I describe as the companions. Those that were not really the parties, that were not really the one driving, really making the machine, saying, what kind of Mozambique do we want? What kind of political process do we want? What kind of polity do we want? But rather the one that were close to the Brother Wright and say, well, you can do this, or you can do that, or maybe you can try this, or you can try that. And these were primarily the Community of Sant'Egidio. The Community of Sant'Egidio, you need to imagine, are people that cannot be paid for what they do. None of us can be paid. And have a very strong sense of a spiritual call that if you are in a place, you are there for a reason. And that it's very important for you to understand why you are there at that time doing that particular things. So we would be like being close to the Brothers Wright and saying, wow, if you fly, if you are able to fly, that means that the whole humanity is going to be flying. If you fly, everybody can fly. So we were there, whoa, applauding and cheering and trying and helping. And guess what? we discovered that in this negotiation, a lot of things were very important. Driving was very important, because Rome is very chaotic and people are very nervous and there is a lot of traffic. And if the driver is actually cool and simpatico and present, and the negotiators are actually in a better mood. If you had dinner the day before and you could go on difficult points with the delegations before, people could actually be closer. We discovered that we could use Rome, the beauty of Rome, to help people relax and move away from some harshness. So together with Andrea and Matteo, there were hundreds of people participating in the negotiation for 2.5 years, doing all sorts of things. Cooking. I can tell you that good wine and good food in Rome were part of the agreement. It's good to be in Rome. It's good to have a sense that peace is possible now. So the role of the companions was to say to people that have been in war for such a long time, peace is possible. Not just up here, not just over there. Peace is possible for you now. You can be at peace. You can be in peace. You can start thinking as a person in peace. And if that's possible, then the negotiation will be very different. But the role of the companions was also to say, do not be afraid of your limits, in all directions. One day, one head of the delegation came and he was clearly upset. He had a big toothache. He was really in pain. Well, in a normal negotiation, formally, there was nothing you could do. Sant'Egidio would just go to the dentist, have the tooth fixed, and he was very happy. There is a caring for the person that was key. But there was also a limitation of things like, what is the constitutional debate today that we need to take into account? Well, Italy had dozens of scholars that were very eager to engage on the constitutional debate of a parliamentarian solution or a presidential solution, a confederation or a federation, a unitary state of a... Well, all those resources were made available to the parties through the companions. A lot of people were eager to participate in the construction of peace because they found that the idea of helping a country that was never unified, never at peace, never independent before, like Mozambique, was a wonderful opportunity to say, you know, the colonial legacy has been terrible. Millions of people have suffered. But there is a time now to help people that want to be together peacefully. And a lot of people responded to that, saying, I want to participate. So the companion found themselves not only learning for themselves how to help, but they found that they could be a bridge with many others, helping in a chain that was making the peace agreement possible. There is a third category of people that learn through the process, and those are the observers, those that were not the parties, they were not the companions, but they're the one outside. Well, sometimes the observers were a little obnoxious, I can tell you. I remember when I came to this country, I was speaking English very badly, and I explained the peace process in Mozambique that we were negotiating, and I got 3 very blunt, negative feedback. The first was, why are you negotiating with human rights abusers? The second was, why do you think that this agreement will last? Because it's not realistic. The power structure is not there. And the third was, why aren't you not following my conflict resolution process? And I remember that I responded to this Harvard professor well, if your conflict resolution process doesn't explain my peace, you need to change your theory, not the other way around. The two realist and human rights objections are very reasonable. But what Mozambique demonstrated is that the agreement of the people actually was distributing power correctly. And to the human rights advocates that said, there is nothing you can do once you have a crime. You only have to persecute and put people in jail. There is an answer that says, human rights violation needs to be stopped and make sure that the new state will not abuse again. That's your responsibility. And to imagine that a narrow definition of prosecution is the only answer you have is just not right. In Mozambique, the recruitment strategy of both, but especially of Renamo, was to go in a village and round up all the kids, 8, 10, 12 years old. Bring them to the camps, send them back to the village, and ask them to kill their families so that they will never be back again. Think about it. Think about prosecution for a moment. Is a 12 years old forced to kill his own family? Somebody that you can just take and bring to The Hague? I don't think so. I think that he was a victim as much as he was a perpetrator. And the Mozambican response was interesting. After the war was over, they said there was a spirit of war that took us into madness, and we did terrible things to one another. But after the war is over, we need to enter into each other's life again. So what did they do? They took all these soldiers, now 18, 20, 22 years old, that had known only violence in their life. They brought into the community, and they had rituals cleansing. They were cleansed ritually. And the church helped in this wonderful idea of saying, you are whole again. You are part of the community. There is a much lower level of violence in Mozambique today than in South Africa. Think about what Mozambique is telling us about the learning from the challenge of war and the invitation to peace. Many observers looking at Mozambique say, oh, no, we cannot do that. We need to have human rights procedures and formal structures and do this and do that and spend millions of dollars in The Hague. I'm not so sure. I like the idea that people can be invited into their own responsibility of choosing. That the parties, the companions, and the observers can all invite each other into the learning that comes when we decide that somebody's need is an invitation for us to do exactly as the Brothers Wright were doing when they invented an airplane. That is to say, if we want this need to be met, if we want this challenge to be encountered correctly, what do we need to do? How do you do these things? The level of uncertainty in July 1990 is very similar to the level of uncertainty that we have almost in front of any human challenge. Do we really know what we are doing when we look at HIV/AIDS or unemployment or ecological disasters? I'm not so sure. I'd rather prefer a community of seekers and learners than a community of powerful, self-assured, that impose solutions on others just because they have the power to do so. I much rather have people asking questions and responding to the questions rather than people having answers and imposing answers on anyone. I don't think that many airplanes would ever fly if you were to say, oh, this is how the airplane is going to work, and you don't check it out, and you don't see if the actual airplane actually is flying. So when we ask ourselves about the experience of peacemaking, learning from the community of Sant'Egidio, I would like to contend that the learning has been tremendous for the parties, the companions, and the observers. But today, by you inviting me into this audience, you are in a way participating in this effort of learning about peacemaking. Because the peacemaking that is needed will come from you. The peacemaking that this country needs will come from you. The peacemaking that this world needs will come from you. So I'm happy in a way that I can engage with you in this way, as a person that accepts his limitation. There are certain things that I know, but many others that I don't. What I know is that peacemaking is conversational. That peacemaking comes when people start being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible. When people start thinking that the history that they live, the world they live, is not just something that happened outside themselves, but is literally made by the word they use, by the thought they have, by the feelings that they try to one another. I gave you that example of the word of John 23rd, ending up in an agreement that had nothing to do with nothing. But how beautiful it is to think that your words, the words that you're learning here at Seton Hall, will be the words that will be in the agreement tomorrow that will end the violence with the maras, the violence with the gangs, the violence in our cities, the violence among so many communities that are just waiting for somebody to come and do the same thing that the Community of Sant'Egidio did. How beautiful it is to think that Professor Zhang Wan's words will be the one that helped China and the US to come together in peace and stay in peace for a long time to go. How beautiful it is to think that history is just a form of human responsibility. It's not a given. It's not a destiny. It's not something that is dumped on us and we cannot do anything. It's not like an enmity system. We can think differently. The Community of Sant'Egidio was fortunate and capable of doing that in the peace in Mozambique, and then in Algeria, in Guatemala, and most recently in Ivory Coast, in Burundi, many other places. And I was lucky enough to be a young witness of that process. It took me 20 years after I came to try to come to terms with that process, with the gift that that process is. Today, 20 years later, we are happy to celebrate. Thank you.
I'm happy to invite Professor DeFeese to come and give us a response.
Thank you very much, Monsignor Liddy, for this invitation to respond. And Professor Bartoli has just given us an excellent example of peacemaking and dispute resolution. And since I teach international law, I'm going to approach this subject from an international law point of view. And international law is very specific when it comes to conflict resolution. At one time, war or the use of force was an accepted way to resolve disputes. Indeed, St. Thomas Aquinas talked about a just war. But that phrase, just war, has really been relegated to, I think, the dustbin of history. The concept of the just war has changed dramatically with the adoption of the UN Charter. And if you think about it, we don't have war anymore, do we? We have maybe Desert Storm, we have surges, we have Desert Shield, etc., but no war. The United Nations Charter really places a twofold obligation on all member states with respect to resolving disputes. First, under Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, there's a negative obligation to refrain from the use of force, except in self-defense. And this is a so-called peremptory norm of international law, which means that all nations have to abide by that norm and cannot deviate from it. Secondly, there is a positive obligation to settle disputes by peaceful means, and that's under Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. And it sets out the preferred methods for resolving disputes, and they include negotiation, inquiry, mediation, arbitration, judicial settlement, or other peaceful means of their own choice. And of course, as Professor Bartoli has pointed out, the importance of conflict resolution and peaceful settlement of disputes cannot be overemphasized. And indeed, the international community has come to accept new norms and new responsibilities in international law to resolve conflicts. NGOs and faith-based groups like Sant'Egidio community that we have heard about play a very significant role these days in implementing these new norms. Now, what are some of the new mechanisms and norms that are developing in international law over the last decade or so? And from really the deadly conflicts that mark the 20th century, two very hopeful concepts in international law have emerged. One, peace building, and two, responsibility to protect. Each requires individual states, the international communities, and non-governmental organizations, such as the community that we've heard about, to undertake specific positive actions in conflicted and post-conflict societies. Now, the term peace building is a relatively new term in international law. It was launched in 1992 and goes beyond short-term humanitarian relief and crisis intervention. It's a term that's used to describe outside intervention and prevent the start of violence or the resumption of violent conflict within a nation. Although many of peace-building's aims overlap with those of peacemaking and conflict resolution, it's a distinct idea. Peacemaking involves stopping an ongoing conflict, such as the situation that we heard about in Mozambique, whereas peace-building happens before a conflict starts or once it ends. And in 2007, the United Nations defined peace-building as follows, and I quote, "Peace-building involves a range of measures targeted to reduce the risk of lapsing or relapsing into conflict by strengthening national capacities at all levels for conflict management. Peace-building strategies must be coherent, they must be tailored to the specific needs of the country concerned, and it must be based on national ownership." The tasks included in peace-building vary depending on the situation and the institution or the agent involved. They might include developing rule of law, institutions, counseling, increasing human rights, and support for civil society. Catholic Relief Services, for example, is an example of an NGO that is instrumental in peace building, not necessarily peacemaking. Turning to the responsibility to protect, conflict resolution and peacemaking is very central to this so-called responsibility to protect, a concept that has just emerged, I would say, in the last decade. And the norms of responsibility to protect were articulated in the early part of the 21st century. in the wake of the genocides that occurred in Rwanda and in Srebrenica. The world stood by, if you remember, as more than 1 million people were murdered in those countries as a result of the genocide. The United Nations refused to act, and no country stepped in to stop the genocide. Probably in a show of remorse or in shame, and under the leadership of the United Nations, a new doctrine started to emerge, the so-called responsibility to protect. And it came to be accepted because the world community wanted to assure that such a genocide would not occur again. Responsibility to protect affirms that each state has a responsibility to protect their own populations from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And when governments fail to protect their own people, other states acting through the United Nations have the responsibility to protect threatened populations, even using military force if necessary. However, as Archbishop Mamberti of the Holy See Mission to the United Nations pointed out recently in his address to the General Assembly last year, the responsibility to protect must be understood not only in terms of military intervention, but above all as an imperative for the international community to be united before the crisis and to create agencies for correct and sincere negotiations. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly, Pope Benedict XVI noted that while the responsibility to protect has only recently been defined, it was always present implicitly at the origins of the United Nations and is now increasingly characteristic of his activity. Now, the responsibility to protect entails a threefold responsibility: a responsibility to prevent, a responsibility to react, and a responsibility to rebuild when confronted with mass atrocities. And this responsibility can be discharged in many ways, including diplomacy, technical assistance, humanitarian assistance, etc. But one aspect that must be incorporated into the fulfillment of each of these three responsibilities is the promotion and the facilitation of conflict resolution. And in this task, international organizations, states, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations such as the community that we've just heard about, can play a very important role. The goal of both peace building and responsibility to protect is to develop an international environment that achieves international protection and accountability, and which contributes to long-term development. Now, something that I haven't heard about today, but which should be addressed, is the important role of women in peacemaking. In the year 2000, the United Nations Security Council passed a landmark resolution, resolution number 1325. And that resolution notes that during periods of conflict, women and children account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed conflict. Yet they are often overlooked in the peacemaking process. And the Security Council in that landmark resolution, and I'm going to quote from that resolution, quote, urged member states to ensure increased representation of women in all decision-making levels in the national, regional, and international institution and mechanism for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. Further, it called upon the Secretary General to implement a strategic plan of action to increase the participation of women in decision-making levels and in conflict resolution. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to stress that all measures to prevent and respond to conflict and to be building a devastated population must be specifically tailored to the situation. There's not one-size-fits-all solution to the deadly conflicts that continue to plague the world. And the very flexible Sant'Egidio community is poised to be both proactive and reactive in these situations, in conflict situations. And we can certainly all learn from studying their experience. However, what is clear is that all members of the international community, not only members of states, but also individuals and NGOs, have a very important role to play in increasing conflict resolution and peace building. And we should all be grateful to Dr. Bartoli for sharing the Sant'Egidio experience with us. Clearly, we cannot duplicate that experience, but we certainly can hope to emulate it. Thank you.
Elizabeth, would you want to sit here? And, yeah, and then we have some time for questions. So Seton Hall speaks of developing servant leaders. So I have a question for Professor Bartoli in terms of, I think of Sant'Egidio as soup kitchens and young people who are able to serve their neighbors in quite direct ways, and moving from that out to the international scene. So anyway, if you go to the soup kitchens of the community in Rome, you'll meet many people like yourselves here today. So I just, I don't know if Andrea would like to comment on that.
Happy to. There is a very strong link between the experience of serving the poor and the experience of serving peace. I think that we are delighted that Seton Hall has this effort to create servant leaders. We believe that service is actually a way of understanding that is central to our experience as a human person, as Christians. Service to the poor is a fundamental component of the experience of Sant'Egidio. Any member of the community must serve. There is a simple rule that says that nobody is so poor, so old, so weak, not to be able to serve. And so even if you are a 94 years old woman in Manhattan, homebound, you are supposed to serve. And there is something very liberating about that rule. Very often when we give up on people and think, well, he's too poor to serve others, or he's too old to serve others, he's too something to serve others, we are actually taking something. We are depriving that person of the dignity of serving others, of being fully helpful and so on. So the community has a very simple rule, and as we all know, Martin Luther King had a very similar idea. Everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And I think that it's very important to see the link on peacemaking very clearly. For us, peace is something that everyone longs for. And its absence is what you see when you see war, when you see conflict, when you see violence. So when you see violence, you need to see a situation in which there is something missing. It's like a desert, where you have no water. Imagine take the water out of your body, and how everything becomes frail. Imagine taking something away, you take air away. So the community sees service as a way to put the water where the water is needed, to put the air where the air is needed, to put what is missing back in place. And I think it's important to see this effort not just as a one-shot thing that you do once, but rather as a lifelong commitment. We started working on Mozambique in 1975-76, still working in Mozambique way after the peace agreement was signed, and will continue to do so. So I think that service is definitely very much. Do you want me to recognize people? And please.
Thank you. Dr. Bartoli, when we were reading the communique, you stressed this sentence, that both parties agreed that they must set aside what divides them and focus as a matter of priority on what unites them. So it seems like without them having agreed to this, it would have been very difficult for them to agree to a peace, lastly. So I wonder, how do you get it, having parties that are in the middle of a conflict come to this consensus? How do you do that? Is that something that can be ordered from from outside? Is there a place for NGOs to maybe influence people to believe that, or is that something that only parties in the conflict can get to?
Well, I would say that your question already has the answer within. I think that you can easily imagine that an NGO like the Community of Sant'Egidio had no power to impose anything like that on the parties. They had armies, they had weapons, they had control of the territory, they had a lot of things. We had nothing. We were just an NGO, we were just a community. We could not impose anything. And actually, what we learn is something that we call now a weak mediation. But the paradox of the weak mediation is that because I am weak and I cannot impose on you anything, you must be committed to the process. Because I cannot force you. Okay? What is the advantage of this process? That I can invite you to consider for yourself if this is good for you or not. But once you realize that this is good for yourself, then you are much more committed. Am I getting anywhere?
Yes, I understand.
So, what happened with that sentence is that that sentence was simply an invitation. Now, many people in conflict resolution are looking into issues of political will or addressing this issue of commitment. And they're trying to get at these ideas through external control. Okay? I want to make sure that you and I are committed to this agreement. We ask Monsignor Lidi to certify or to intervene and make sure that we comply. But if you think about any commitment that you and I make, that Monsignor Lidi needs to certify for both of us, is actually much weaker than any agreement that you and I can meet that doesn't need Monsignor Lidi. Making any sense? Okay. So what is interesting here is that the weakness of that statement, because it is only an invitation, it is actually its strength. Because it's an invitation that speaks to the agency, to the capacity of the parties to say for themselves, this is really good for me. I'm not doing it because I have an agreement. I'm not doing it because Monsignor Lidi is watching over me and if I don't comply, then he will say bad things about me. But I'm doing it because it's good for me and I have the capacity to realize that this is good for me. Okay? So what Sant'Egidio did was simply invite at the right time, the right way. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Bartoli.
Speak loudly because they may not...
Dr. Bartoli for everything. And I really appreciate Sant'Egidio work in Algeria for the peace process. I actually went over there right after the conflict. But my question is, how come the Vatican and Sant'Egidio didn't get more involved in the question of Western Sahara?
Well, Western Sahara is a very difficult question, and it was already almost a miracle that Sant'Egidio could say anything meaningful in Algeria. As you know very well, Algeria is a Muslim country, and the community of Sant'Egidio is a very Christian community. So the idea of having all Muslims in Sant'Egidio negotiating the platform for the peaceful resolution of the Algerian crisis, that is the document to which the gentleman is referring to, in 1995, it was just an extraordinary thing. Imagine, these all Muslim nationalists, socialists, Islamists, together negotiating a document that brings together modern, contemporary doctrines of human rights and democracy together with religiously based references to polity and politics. Extraordinary document. Well, that was made possible by the fact that an Algerian theologian from Medea has been a very good friend of the community of Sant'Egidio because he started visiting us after befriending the monks of Tiberin that some of you may know through the movie of Gods and Men,
Right.
Father Christian de Chargé. Those monks were very good friends of Sant'Egidio, to the point that Father Christian came to Sant'Egidio's prayer for peace every single year, for several years, to translate from Italian to Arabic, from Arabic to French, from French to Arabic, and was the conduit for this Muslim theologian to come to know Sant'Egidio, Mohammed Slimani. When the community was able to help Mozambique to end the civil war, Mohammed Slimani, just after the coup d'etat in Algeria, asked the community, "You did Mozambique, why don't you do Algeria?" Wow, how do you do something like that? And so again, we said, well, we cannot do it, but you can. So we can support you in your doing this. He called people, he started inviting people, the Italian government supported. And as I said, there was an incredible document negotiated in Sant'Egidio in 2 sessions. Some of them were confidential, some of them were public. An incredible document. It didn't go very far because the government at that time was not ready to engage. 50,000 people died after that agreement was signed. 50,000 people could have been saved if that agreement was to be accepted. So think about how relevant the choices that we make are. I was mentioning before these things. So in a way, the answer is Sant'Egidio was not involved in Western Sahara because we couldn't find the same channels, the same ways to speak. But we have been following all those dimensions very closely. And this is also a peculiarity of Sant'Egidio, because the people that started doing peacemaking work in the 80s, in the 90s, are still doing it. So Mario Giro, Matteo Zuppi, they are now in their 50s, in their 60s, but they've been around doing this work for 40 years, 30 years. So they know a lot of people. So if there is any opening, we'll be happy to do whatever we can. Please.
Hello, Dr. Bartoli, thank you so much for being here today. My question is in regards to human rights crises that we see popping up all over the world today, in which we see a third party emerging, the private sector, business, all motivated by the dollar, and really the open market and the first world economies. Do we approach peace building, peacemaking in the same manner, with the same approach, or is there a different approach that we should be taking, especially in Sudan with the influence of oil, and in the DRC with the influence of conflict minerals? How do we approach that when we have this third party now emerging?
Thank you for your question. I think that there is certainly a very important ideological dimension that is attached to money, to greed, to the sense of how profit, is sort of a all-encompassing God. But I must admit that on the business side, I tend to believe that things are a little less stark than what you are describing. Not only because people like Tani Rowland, a businessman from the UK, helped during the peace process in Mozambique, but also because many local business people understand very well that peace is actually better for business than conflict. And also that certain cases, like the minerals that you are referring to, can spark a creative response, like the Kimberley process, or processes through which states regulate themselves in relation to specific productions. So I wouldn't necessarily make the argument that because there is a profit to be made, then conflict, violent conflict, destructive conflict makes sense. I would actually contend that, generally speaking, business understand that stability is actually more favorable to business than war. I think that the argument that conflict is good for business is actually a fallacy. If you look at the numbers, you will have the production of the Peace Index that Steve Kilelea and the others are producing now regularly, will demonstrate quite clearly that actually the levels of economic development goes quite well in sync with peacefulness. So the more a nation, the more a country is peaceful, the more is richer. So I would say because people are attentive to the bottom line and they do want to make money, my sense is that they will make peace more. That's my sense. I have a lot of hands. I think that you will need to put some order here because otherwise...
We'll have two more questions after Yomi.
Can the wisdom, expertise, or skills of Community of Sant'Egidio be applied to the immediate problem faced by America? That is, resolution of constant conflicts between Republican Party and Democrats in Congress, because of which the country, economy goes nowhere. Actually, in my eyes, a professional economist, is decaying, you know. You love airplane, me too. Can you share your wisdom regarding how to build an airplane using Republican Party, Democratic Party has two wings, you know, so that they can fly together. After all, it takes two wings to fly. So could you do that? You know?
Thank you. I'm delighted. I'm delighted. Even that you can conceive of such a question. I'm really, I am delighted that you feel that way. I share your concern, and I share this concern of the decline. And everything that the decline is very real. It's very real in many ways because I think that the system is proving very difficult to govern. And the divergence, the movements within towards unhealthy tensions is definitely greater than the capacity for the system to self-correct itself. I have two observations on that. One is that institutionally the United States has been extremely stable. I come from a country that is culturally very old, you know, Italy, Rome, you know, 2,000 years. But institutionally very young, or much younger than the U.S. We started just, you know, like last century, 2nd century, 100 years ago. And I think that 150 years ago. And I think that the institutional dimension of the U.S. could provide some sense that the energies are there to reorient the whole system. The other element of hopefulness is just the people. Is that the concentration of diverse people in the U.S. is extraordinary. I clearly put myself in the mix so, as a newcomer. But it's not that common to find a place where you have so many diverse people interacting with one another. So my hope is that rather than the Community of Sant'Egidio per se, and the people of the U.S. and the institution of the U.S. will help guide the way for a constructive response.
Maybe one last question.
Please.
Hi, I'm especially interested in what your collective response would be to the situation we see with Syria, where we have two major national members of the Security Council thwarting efforts or initiatives that the UN might take with respect to Syria. That's apparently slaughtering and we get China and Russia simply saying no, and it inhibits. Further, we have the UN has resisted, or U.S. particularly has resisted the development of a standing UN force that can intervene quickly in such catastrophes. Where do negotiations, where do they go in this kind of a situation?
I have a professional response and a Sant'Egidio response. I'll give you the professional response first, and then I'll give you the Sant'Egidio one. The professional response is that the US is moving in a very interesting place. So President Obama today announced the formation of this board dedicated to atrocities prevention. This is a very bold move that allows the US to use institutions that were just not there before. So it's a very interesting moment in the direction of R2P, and we will see what happens. On the Syria case, however, I would strongly recommend you to appreciate the nuances. It is not only that Israel is much more in favor of Assad than of anything else, but it's also true that the Christians in the country are by far in favor of Assad more than anything else. Because their fear is that a Sunni-led Muslim dictatorship may be very difficult for them to handle, especially after what happened in Iraq, where half of the Christians had to flee after the war. So I would be very careful about framing this as a Russia-China on one side and the US and the West on the other. I think that the US is in a very different place. It's not Syria, it's not Libya. I think that it's a very, very nuanced position. So I would be...
yeah, but are you suggesting that Russia and China are worried about the Christian support?
No. I was telling you...
Clearly not.
I was telling you the American position as much more nuanced than what it could appear if you have only this sort of external thing. So that's my point. The Sant'Egidio answer is that we visited Syria when we were very young. We had a very important relationship with the Christians in Syria. For anyone who has any desire for an appreciation of the riches of the Christian experience, I think that preserving Syria Christian heritage is a very, very important dimension. Christians have been there since the beginning. If you go to Damascus and you walk on the right street, you still find the house where Ananias was welcoming Paul blind after the conversion. It's moving. But it's also a place where the memory of Abdel Kader is maintained, this incredible Sufi leader that resisted the French occupation of Algeria in 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and ended up saving 5,000 Christians in Damascus when a mob wanted to kill them all. And in the name of Muslim hospitality, he saved them. So what I'm saying is that there is a heritage of love and hospitality, brotherhood and respect that we need to preserve. The challenges of the moment are too serious to be resolved by bombing, by just using violence. I think that it's very important for us to always keep looking for the peace that is possible.
I want to thank Professor Bartoli, Dean Bartoli, and Professor DeFees for being with us. The words that come to me are, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. So let that be something that guides our own relationships here at Seton Hall, and as we go out from here to live our own vocations wherever they may lead us. So thank you very much for